Das Kapital by Karl Marx. This is the complete book of Das Kapital, written by Karl Marx. This episode series presents the entire work in full. It is not a summary and not an audiobook, but the complete book itself. Episode 1, Volume 1, A Critique of Political Economy. Book 1, The Process of Production of Capital. Chapter 1, Commodities. Section 1, The Two Factors of a Commodity, Use Value and Value. The substance of value and the magnitude of value.
The beginning. What is a commodity? Marx starts Das Kapital with a simple but profound observation about capitalist societies. He writes, "The wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity." Think about that for a moment. When you look around at a capitalist economy, what do you see? Everywhere you look, there are things for sale, products, goods, what Marx calls commodities. And all the wealth in this system appears in this form, as this massive pile of stuff that can be bought and sold. So if we want to understand capitalism, Marx tells us we need to start at the most basic level. We need to understand what a commodity actually is. What makes something a commodity? Marx begins with a straightforward definition. He says, "A commodity is, in the first place, an object outside us, a thing that by its properties satisfies human wants of some sort or another. So a commodity is simply a thing that satisfies some human need or desire." And here's something interesting. Marx notes that the nature of such wants, whether, for instance, they spring from the stomach or from fancy, makes no difference. What does this mean? It means Marx isn't making a moral judgment about what we need. Whether you need bread to eat or you want a fancy watch because you like how it looks, both needs are treated the same way in this analysis. The commodity satisfies a want. That's what matters. He also points out that it doesn't matter whether the thing satisfies our wants directly as means of subsistence or indirectly as means of production. So bread that you eat and iron that you use to make tools are both commodities in the same sense. The two sides of every commodity. Now here's where things get interesting. Marx tells us that every useful thing can be looked at from two different angles: quality and quantity. As he puts it, every useful thing, as iron, paper, and so on, may be looked at from the 2 points of view of quality and quantity. It is an assemblage of many properties, and may therefore be of use in various ways. Think about iron. What are its qualities? It's strong, it's malleable, it conducts heat. These qualities mean it can be used in many different ways. To make tools, to build structures, to create machinery. And Marx makes an interesting historical point here. He says, "To discover the various uses of things is the work of history. Throughout human history, we've gradually discovered new ways to use the things around us. We've also developed socially recognized standards of measure for these things. We measure iron in tons, cloth in yards, grain in bushels. These measurements partly come from the nature of the objects themselves, and partly from social convention. Use value, the utility of things. This brings us to the first key concept, use value. Marx writes, the utility of a thing makes it a use value. But he immediately clarifies something important. But this utility is not a thing of air. Being limited by the physical properties of the commodity, it has no existence apart from that commodity. What's he saying here? Use value isn't some abstract idea floating in the air. It's grounded in the real, physical properties of actual things. Iron is useful because of what iron actually is, because of its real properties as a material. Marx gives us examples. A commodity, such as iron, corn, or a diamond, is therefore, so far as it is a material thing, a use value, something useful. And here's a crucial point. This property of a commodity is independent of the amount of labor required to appropriate its useful qualities. In other words, how useful something is has nothing to do with how much work went into making it. A diamond is useful because of its physical properties, not because of the labor involved in mining it. Use value is about the thing itself and what it can do for us. Marx also notes, use values become a reality only by use or consumption. A coat keeps you warm only when you wear it. Food nourishes you only when you eat it. Use value is realized in the actual using of the thing. And finally, they also constitute the substance of all wealth, whatever may be the social form of that wealth. In any type of society, whether capitalist or not, useful things are what make up wealth. But in capitalism, Marx adds, they are, in addition, the material depositories of exchange value. Exchange value. The puzzle begins. Now we come to the second key concept, exchange value. Marx describes it this way. Exchange value, at first sight, presents itself as a quantitative relation, as the proportion in which values in use of one sort are exchanged for those of another sort, a relation constantly changing with time and place. So exchange value is about ratios. It's about the proportions in which we trade things. Today, one coat might exchange for 20 yards of cloth. Tomorrow, or in another place, it might be different. And this creates a puzzle, as Marx observes. Hence, exchange value appears to be something accidental and purely relative, and consequently an intrinsic value. That is, an exchange value that is inseparably connected with, inherent in commodities, seems a contradiction in terms. Think about what he's pointing to here. If exchange values are always changing, always relative to time and place, how can they be intrinsic to the commodities themselves? It seems contradictory. But then Marx says, let us consider the matter a little more closely. The search for something equal. Here's where Marx's detective work really begins. He asks us to consider a specific example. A given commodity, for example, a quarter of wheat is exchanged for X blacking, Y silk, or Z gold, and so on, in short, for other commodities in the most different proportions. So 1/4 of wheat can be exchanged for many different things in many different amounts. Instead of having just one exchange value, the wheat seems to have many exchange values. But Marx notices something crucial. Since X blacking, Y silk, or Z gold, and so on, each represents the exchange value of 1/4 of wheat, X blacking, Y silk, Z gold, and so on, must as exchange values be replaceable by each other or equal to each other. What does this mean? If a quarter of wheat exchanges for a certain amount of silk and also exchanges for a certain amount of gold, then that amount of silk and that amount of gold must be equal to each other as exchange values. They must express something equal. Marx draws two conclusions. Therefore, first, the valid exchange values of a given commodity express something equal. Secondly, exchange value, generally, is only the mode of expression, the phenomenal form of something contained in it, yet distinguishable from it. So exchange value is just the outward form, the appearance of something deeper. But what is that something? The geometric analogy. Marx uses a mathematical analogy to make this clearer. He says, let us take two commodities, for example, corn and iron. The proportions in which they are exchangeable, whatever those proportions may be, can always be represented by an equation in which a given quantity of corn is equated to some quantity of iron. For example, 1/4 corn equals X hundredweight iron. Now here's the key question. What does this equation tell us? It tells us that in two different things, in 1/4 of corn and X hundredweight of iron, there exists in equal quantities something common to both. The two things must therefore be equal to a third, which in itself is neither the one nor the other. Think about it. If corn equals iron in exchange, they must both equal something else. They must both be expressions of some third thing. Marx gives us a geometric comparison. In order to calculate and compare the areas of rectilinear figures, we decompose them into triangles. But the area of the triangle itself is expressed by something totally different from its visible figure, namely, by half the product of the base multiplied by the altitude. Just as different shapes can all be expressed in terms of area, different commodities must be expressible in terms of something common to them all. What exchange value is not? So what is this common something? Marx starts by ruling out what it cannot be. He says, this common something cannot be either a geometrical, a chemical, or any other natural property of commodities. Such properties claim our attention only insofar as they affect the utility of those commodities, make them use values. The common element can't be any physical or natural property, because those properties are what give things their use value. But here's the crucial insight. The exchange of commodities is evidently an act characterized by a total abstraction from use value. When we exchange commodities, we're not paying attention to their specific usefulness. Marx quotes an old writer named Barben, who put it bluntly, "One sort of wares are as good as another, if the values be equal. There is no difference or distinction in things of equal value. £100 worth of lead or iron is of as great value as £100 worth of silver or gold." Marx puts it even more starkly. As use values, commodities are above all of different qualities. But as exchange values, they are merely different quantities, and consequently do not contain an atom of use value. When we think of commodities as exchange values, we completely ignore what they're useful for. We treat them purely as quantities, not qualities. So if we set aside use value, what's left? Marx gives us the answer. If then we leave out of consideration the use value of commodities, they have only one common property left, that of being products of labor. But not just any labor. Something important happens when we abstract from use value. If we make abstraction from its use value, we make abstraction at the same time from the material elements and shapes that make the product a use value. We see in it no longer a table, a house yarn, or any other useful thing. When we stop thinking about the specific usefulness of products, we also stop thinking about the specific kinds of labor that made them. As Marx explains, neither can it any longer be regarded as the product of the labor of the joiner, the mason, the spinner, or of any other definite kind of productive labor. We're no longer thinking about carpentry or masonry or spinning. We're thinking about something more abstract. Along with the useful qualities of the products themselves, we put out of sight both the useful character of the various kinds of labor embodied in them and the concrete forms of that labor. There is nothing left but what is common to them all. All are reduced to one and the same sort of labor, human labor in the abstract. Human labor in the abstract. This is a crucial concept. Marx is saying that when we exchange commodities, we are treating all the different kinds of labor as if they were the same thing, just human labor in general, without regard to its specific form. He continues, "Let us now consider the residue of each of these products. It consists of the same unsubstantial reality in each, a mere congelation of homogeneous human labor of labor power, expended without regard to the mode of its expenditure. What a vivid image! The value in commodities is like congealed or crystallized labor, its labor frozen in the product. All that these things now tell us is that human labor power has been expended in their production, that human labor is embodied in them. When looked at as crystals of this social substance, common to them all, they are values. Notice the capital V. This is value in the specific sense Marx is defining it. It's not just usefulness, it's embodied abstract human labor. Marx summarizes, therefore, the common substance that manifests itself in the exchange value of commodities whenever they are exchanged is their value. Exchange value is the form in which value appears. Value itself is the substance. And that substance is abstract human labor. The measuring value. Now Marx asks the logical next question. He's established that value comes from abstract human labor. But how do we measure it? A use value, or useful article, therefore, has value only because human labor in the abstract has been embodied or materialized in it. How, then, is the magnitude of this value to be measured? Plainly by the quantity of the value-creating substance, the labor, contained in the article. So value is measured by the quantity of labor. But how do we measure the quantity of labor? The quantity of labor, however, is measured by its duration, and labor time in its turn finds its standard in weeks, days, and hours. That's how we measure value. But here, Marx anticipates an obvious objection. The lazy worker. Objection. Marx knows what you're thinking. Some people might think that if the value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of labor spent on it, the more idle and unskillful the laborer, the more valuable would his commodity be, because more time would be required in its production. If I'm a terrible shoemaker, and it takes me 10 hours to make a pair of shoes that a skilled worker makes in 2 hours, are my shoes 5 times more valuable? That seems absurd. Marx's answer is crucial. The labor, however, that forms the substance of value, is homogeneous human labor, expenditure of one uniform labor power. It's not about individual labor time, it's about social labor time. As Marx explains, the total labor power of society, which is embodied in the sum total of the values of all commodities produced by that society, counts here as one homogeneous mass of human labor power composed, though it be of innumerable individual units. Labor time. We have to think about labor not as individual efforts but as a social whole. And within that social whole, each unit of labor counts as average labor. Each of these units is the same as any other, so far as it has the character of the average labor power of society, and takes effect as such. That is, so far as it requires for producing a commodity no more time than is needed on an average, nor more than is socially necessary. Socially necessary labor time. This brings us to one of the most important concepts in Marx's entire analysis: socially necessary labor time. Marx defines it precisely. The labor time socially necessary is that required to produce an article under the normal conditions of production, and with the average degree of skill and intensity prevalent at the time. So it's not about how long it takes one person, it's about how long it takes on average, under normal conditions, with average skill. Marx gives us a historical example. The introduction of power looms into England probably reduced by 1/2 the labor required to weave a given quantity of yarn into cloth. The hand loom weavers, as a matter of fact, continued to require the same time as before. But for all that, the product of 1 hour of their labor represented, after the change, only half an hour's social labor, and consequently fell to 1/2 its former value. This is a devastating insight for those hand-loom weavers. They're still working just as hard, for just as long, but because the socially necessary labor time has been cut in half by new technology, the value of their products has been cut in half too. Marx states the principle clearly. We see then that that which determines the magnitude of the value of any article is the amount of labor socially necessary, or the labor time socially necessary for its production. And importantly, each individual commodity, in this connection, is to be considered as an average sample of its class. Final distinctions. Marx ends with some important clarifications about what can and cannot be a commodity. A thing can be a use value without having value. This is the case whenever its utility to man is not due to labor. Such are air, virgin soil, natural meadows, and so on. Air is useful, but it has no value because no labor went into producing it. It's freely available from nature. A thing can be useful and the product of human labor without being a commodity. Whoever directly satisfies his wants with the produce of his own labor creates, indeed, use values, but not commodities. If you grow tomatoes in your garden and eat them yourself, you've created use values, but not commodities. Why not? Because you haven't produced them for exchange. Marx clarifies further. In order to produce the latter, he must not only produce use values, but use values for others, social use values. But even that's not enough. And not only for others, without more. The medieval peasant produced quit-rent corn for his feudal lord and tithe corn for his parson. But neither the quit-rent corn nor the tithe corn became commodities by reason of the fact that they had been produced for others. The peasant's grain went to the lord and the priest, so it was for others. But it wasn't exchanged. It was an obligation, a duty. To become a commodity, a product must be transferred to another, whom it will serve as a use value by means of an exchange. So for something to be a commodity, it must be produced for exchange, not just for others. And finally, lastly, nothing can have value without being an object of utility. If the thing is useless, so is the labor contained in it. The labor does not count as labor and therefore creates no value. No matter how much work you put into making something, if it's useless, it has no value. Use value is the precondition for exchange value. What we've learned. Let's step back and see what Marx has accomplished in this opening section. He started with a simple observation that in capitalism, wealth appears as an accumulation of commodities. He then analyzed what a commodity is, discovering that it has two aspects: use value and exchange value. Use value is straightforward. It's the usefulness of a thing based on its physical properties. But exchange value led Marx on a journey of discovery. By asking what allows different commodities to exchange at definite ratios, he found that they must have something in common, that something cannot be their physical properties or their usefulness, because exchange abstracts from use value entirely. What's left is that they're all products of labor, but not specific kinds of labor, rather abstract human labor in general. This abstract human labor, congealed or crystallized in commodities, is what Marx calls value. Value is measured by labor time, but not individual labor time. It's measured by socially necessary labor time, the time required to produce something under normal conditions with average skill. This means value changes with productivity. As we get better at making things, as technology improves, the value of those things falls. The same item requires less socially necessary labor time, so it has less value. And finally, Marx clarified that for something to be a commodity, it must be useful, it must be a product of labor, and it must be produced for exchange. These concepts, use value, exchange value, value, abstract labor, and socially necessary labor time, are the foundations of everything that follows in Das Kapital. Marx will use these tools to unlock the mysteries of how capitalism works, how profit arises, how workers are exploited, and how the system develops and changes over time. But that's for the next parts of our journey.
Next, Episode 2. Section 2, the twofold character of the labor embodied in commodities. Join us in the next chapter as Marx's argument continues to unfold.
We've got some amazing content coming your way. Subscribe now so you're first in line for fresh insights and all the good stuff you won't want to miss.